Margaret had married Silas Blackwood for his money and his protection. What she hadn't counted on was finding the 3 graves behind the apple orchard, each marked with a wife's name and the same death date, exactly 364 days after their wedding. Tomorrow would be Margaret's 364th day as Mrs. Blackwood. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Colorado Territory as Margaret O'Sullivan Blackwood stood among the apple trees, her calloused hands trembling as she traced the carved letters on the weathered headstones. Mary Blackwood died September 15, 1871. Sarah Blackwood died September 15, 1872. Each woman had lived exactly 364 days as Silas Blackwood's wife. Tomorrow was September 15, 1874. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that she'd come to Blackwood Ranch seeking safety, fleeing the violent streets of Chicago where she'd barely survived as an orphaned pickpocket and con artist. She'd answered Silas's newspaper advertisement for a mail-order bride with forged references and a fabricated past, presenting herself as a demure Irish seamstress seeking a respectable marriage. The truth was far more complicated. Margaret O'Sullivan was a survivor who'd learned to read people's intentions in their eyes, to spot danger before it struck, and to disappear when necessary. But somehow, she'd missed the most important signs of all. The Blackwood Ranch sprawled across 10,000 acres of some of the richest grazing land in Colorado, with the Rocky Mountains providing a majestic backdrop to what should have been paradise. The main house was a 2-story Victorian structure painted white with green shutters, surrounded by well-tended gardens and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. Silas himself was everything a woman could want in a husband, tall, handsome in a weathered way, with gentle gray eyes and silver threading through his dark hair. At 42 he was established, respected in the community, and seemingly devoted to making his new bride happy. He was also, Margaret now realized, a methodical killer. The pattern was so precise it couldn't be coincidence. 3 wives, 3 deaths, all on the same date exactly 1 year after their weddings. It suggested planning, patience, and a level of cold calculation that made Margaret's blood run cold despite the warm September morning. She'd discovered the graves by accident while picking apples for the pie. Silas had requested for their anniversary dinner tomorrow. The small cemetery was hidden behind a grove of mature apple trees, far enough from the main house to avoid casual discovery, but close enough for convenient access. Each grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, and a headstone that looked professionally carved, suggesting Silas had spared no expense in memorializing his victims. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to think. In Chicago, when the gangs were closing in or the police were getting too interested in her activities, she'd learned to think several moves ahead. What would her next steps be if she were trying to escape rather than survive? But this situation was different. She was trapped on an isolated ranch with nowhere to run, married to a man who'd perfected the art of murdering wives, with less than 24 hours before she was scheduled to join his collection. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted her dark thoughts. Margaret quickly stepped away from the graves, grabbing her apple basket and trying to look like she'd been innocently harvesting fruit. Through the trees, she could see Silas riding toward the house on his bay stallion, returning early from his weekly trip to town for supplies. "Margaret, darling?" His voice carried across the yard, warm and affectionate as always. "I've brought you a surprise from town." She forced a smile and waved, her mind racing. How long did she have before he realized she'd discovered his secret? More importantly, how could she survive the next 24 hours when 3 other women had failed before her? As she walked back toward the house, basket of apples in hand, Margaret's survival instincts kicked into high gear. She needed information, and she needed it fast. Tonight, while Silas slept, she would search the house for clues about how the other wives had died and why. Knowledge was power, and power was the only thing that might keep her alive long enough to escape. The ranch house felt different now that she knew its true nature, not a home, but a carefully constructed trap. As she entered through the kitchen door, she noticed details that had seemed charming before, but now felt ominous. The way Silas had insisted she use only certain dishes, claiming the others were too precious for daily use. The locked room upstairs that he said contained his late mother's belongings. The herbal garden he tended so carefully, with plants she couldn't identify. "There's my beautiful wife," Silas said, emerging from the parlor with a small wrapped package in his hands. His smile was genuinely warm, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that had once made her heart flutter. Even knowing what she now knew, it was hard to reconcile this gentle, loving man with a cold-blooded killer. "You're back early," Margaret said, setting down the apple basket and accepting his kiss on her cheek. She had to fight not to flinch at his touch. "I wanted to spend our anniversary evening with you," he said, presenting the package with a flourish. "I know it's a day early, but I couldn't wait." Margaret unwrapped the gift with hands that she willed to remain steady. Inside was a delicate gold locket, intricately engraved with roses and vines. It was beautiful, expensive, and probably very similar to gifts he'd given the other wives. "It's lovely," she managed, her voice only slightly strained. "Thank you." "Here, let me put it on you," Silas said, moving behind her to fasten the chain around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, and Margaret had to suppress a shudder. "There, perfect, just like you." The locket felt heavy against her throat, like a collar or a chain. Margaret touched it gently, wondering if Mary, Sarah, and Elizabeth had worn similar pieces to their graves. "I thought we could have a quiet dinner tonight," Silas continued, moving to the kitchen to unpack the supplies he'd brought from town. "Just the two of us. And tomorrow," his voice took on a strange quality, distant and almost dreamy. "Tomorrow will be very special indeed." Margaret watched him carefully as he unpacked flour, sugar, and what looked like medicinal herbs. "What's so special about tomorrow?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Our first anniversary, of course," Silas said, glancing at her with surprise. "Surely you haven't forgotten? It's been exactly 1 year since we exchanged vows, and you became Mrs. Blackwood." The way he said it sent ice through her veins. There was something ritualistic about his tone, as if he were reciting words from a ceremony she didn't understand. "No, of course I haven't forgotten," Margaret said quickly. "I'm making your favorite apple pie for dessert." "Wonderful," Silas beamed. "And I'll prepare something special for you as well. A traditional recipe that's been in my family for generations. You'll find it quite memorable." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret went through the motions of normal domestic life while her mind worked frantically to devise a plan. She prepared dinner, made conversation about trivial matters, and smiled at Silas's gentle attentions, all while cataloging every detail that might prove useful. She noticed that Silas was unusually attentive to what she ate and drank, always ensuring her water glass was full and encouraging her to try the special tea he'd brewed. She managed to avoid consuming much of either by claiming a nervous stomach due to anniversary excitement. She also observed that he spent considerable time in his study after dinner, emerging with a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. When she asked about it, he claimed it was a tonic for his recurring headaches, but something about his manner suggested otherwise. That night, Margaret lay in bed beside her husband, listening to his breathing deepen into sleep. She'd feigned exhaustion and retired early, but every nerve in her body was alert. When she was certain Silas was deeply asleep, she carefully slipped from the bed and began her investigation. The locked room upstairs was her first target. Margaret had learned lockpicking during her Chicago days, and the old-fashioned lock yielded to her ministrations after only a few minutes of careful work. What she found inside made her stomach turn. The room wasn't filled with his mother's belongings as Silas had claimed. Instead, it was a carefully organized shrine to his deceased wives. 3 wedding dresses hung in pristine condition, each labeled with a name and date. Mary's dress was simple white cotton with pearl buttons. Sarah's was pale blue silk with delicate lace trim. Elizabeth's was ivory satin with intricate beadwork. A 4th dress hung beside them, the wedding dress Margaret had worn exactly 364 days ago. But the dresses weren't the most disturbing discovery. A large cabinet against one wall contained what could only be described as trophies. Hair ribbons, jewelry, personal items that had belonged to each wife. There were also 3 leather-bound journals, each containing detailed observations about the women's daily routines, preferences, fears, and physical conditions. Margaret opened her own journal with shaking hands. Silas had been documenting her life with scientific precision, noting everything from her eating habits to her menstrual cycle to her sleeping patterns. The final entry, dated just yesterday, contained a chilling notation. Subject shows signs of restlessness and suspicion. Acceleration of timeline may be necessary. She quickly flipped through the other journals, looking for clues about how the previous wives had died. The entries became increasingly clinical as each woman's death date approached, with detailed notes about dosages, timing, and expected effects. It became clear that Silas had been poisoning his wives gradually, building up toxins in their systems over the course of their year-long marriages before delivering a final fatal dose on their anniversaries. The poison appeared to be derived from plants in his carefully tended garden, refined and concentrated through a process he'd perfected over 3 murders. The symptoms were designed to mimic natural illness, weakness, confusion, difficulty breathing, so that their deaths would appear to be from natural causes to any casual observer. Margaret photographed the relevant pages with the small camera she'd hidden in her belongings, evidence that might prove useful if she survived long enough to use it. Then she carefully returned everything to its original position and relocked the door. Her next stop was Silas's study, where she'd seen him working with the mysterious vial. The room was meticulously organized, with medical and botanical texts lining the walls. In a locked drawer, again, easily opened with her improvised tools, she found detailed recipes for various poisons, along with a collection of vials containing different preparations. One vial was labeled Anniversary Special, MOB, Margaret's initials. The contents were clear and odorless, designed to be mixed into food or drink without detection. According to the accompanying notes, the poison would cause a peaceful death that resembled heart failure, with the victim simply falling asleep and never waking up. Margaret pocketed the vial, along with what appeared to be an antidote labeled Emergency Reversal Agent. If Silas planned to poison her tomorrow, she would be ready. But as she prepared to leave the study, Margaret discovered something that changed everything. Hidden behind the medical texts was a fifth journal, one that didn't belong to any of the wives. This journal belonged to Silas himself, and it contained the true story of the Blackwood Ranch murders. The first entry was dated 5 years ago, shortly after the death of Silas's first wife Helen, a woman Margaret had never heard mentioned. According to the journal, Helen had died of genuine natural causes after only 3 months of marriage, leaving Silas devastated and alone. But rather than mourn normally, his grief had twisted into something dark and obsessive. Helen was perfect, he'd written, pure, innocent, devoted. But she was taken from me too soon. I have realized that all women are temporary, that they will all leave me eventually through death or betrayal. The only way to preserve their perfection is to choose the moment of their departure myself. The journal detailed his evolving philosophy about marriage, death, and possession. In his twisted mind, allowing his wives to live beyond their first anniversary risked the possibility that they might change, become less perfect, or worst of all, leave him voluntarily. By killing them at the height of their devotion and beauty, he could preserve them forever as perfect memories. The entries grew increasingly disturbed as Silas refined his methods and began to see himself as an artist of sorts, creating beautiful moments of eternal love through carefully orchestrated death. He wrote about the satisfaction of watching his wives' trust and devotion right up until the moment they died, never suspecting that their loving husband was their murderer. But the most chilling revelation came in recent entries, where Silas had begun to contemplate expanding his activities beyond the ranch. He'd been corresponding with other lonely men through newspaper advertisements, sharing his methods for ensuring wifely devotion, and discussing the possibility of a network of like-minded individuals. Margaret realized she'd stumbled onto something far larger and more dangerous than a single murderous husband. Silas Blackwood was trying to create a system, a methodology that other men could follow to murder their own wives with impunity. As dawn began to break outside the study windows, Margaret knew she had to act fast. She now had evidence of Silas's crimes, but she was still trapped on an isolated ranch, with no way to contact authorities and no guarantee that anyone would believe her word against that of a respected rancher. She had two choices: try to escape immediately and risk being hunted down before reaching help, or stay and attempt to turn the tables on Silas, using his own methods against him. Margaret chose to fight. Returning to the kitchen, she began preparing for their anniversary dinner with deadly purpose. The apple pie that Silas had requested would indeed be special, but not in the way he expected. Using knowledge gained from his own journals, Margaret began preparing her own anniversary surprise. She spent the morning gathering plants from Silas's garden, carefully selecting specimens that his notes indicated were particularly potent. Using his own equipment and following his detailed recipes, she prepared a concentrated extract that would be far more fast-acting than his usual gradual poisoning method. The irony was perfect. Silas would be killed by his own poison, prepared using his own methods, by a wife he'd underestimated because he'd mistaken her survival instincts for domestic compliance. But Margaret's plan was more complex than simple murder. She intended to survive this encounter and ensure that Silas's network of correspondence was exposed to authorities. That meant she needed to be present when he died, with evidence that would support her story of self-defense against a serial killer. As evening approached, Margaret prepared their anniversary dinner with meticulous care. The dining room was decorated with candles and flowers, the table set with their finest china. To any observer, it would appear to be a romantic celebration of marital love. Silas emerged from his study at precisely 6 o'clock, dressed in his best suit, and carrying a bottle of expensive wine he'd been saving for the occasion. His face glowed with anticipation, and what Margaret now recognized as the excitement of a predator about to claim his prey. "My darling wife," he said, kissing her hand with old-fashioned gallantry, "you look absolutely radiant tonight." Margaret had chosen her outfit carefully, a blue dress similar to the one Sarah had worn, which she'd noticed was Silas's apparent favorite based on his journal entries. She wanted him to feel completely confident and unsuspecting until the very end. "Thank you," she replied, allowing him to seat her at the table. "I wanted tonight to be perfect." The dinner proceeded normally, with Silas regaling her with stories about the ranch's history and his plans for their future together. Margaret noticed that he kept refilling her wine glass and encouraging her to drink, clearly expecting the alcohol to make her more susceptible to whatever poison he planned to administer with dessert. She played her part perfectly, pretending to drink while actually disposing of most of the wine when he wasn't looking. She laughed at his jokes, gazed at him with adoring eyes, and generally behaved like a devoted wife celebrating her first anniversary. When it came time for dessert, Margaret served the apple pie with appropriate ceremony. She'd prepared 2 pieces, one for each of them, but only one contained her special ingredient. "This looks delicious," Silas said, accepting his slice with obvious pleasure. "You've become such an accomplished cook this past year." "I had a good teacher," Margaret replied sweetly. "You've taught me so much about everything." Silas took his first bite with obvious satisfaction, then paused. Something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or the first hint that something wasn't quite right. "The flavor is quite unique," he said slowly. "What did you add?" "Just some herbs from your garden," Margaret said innocently. "I wanted to try something special for our anniversary." Understanding began to dawn in Silas's face as the poison took effect faster than his usual preparations. His hand went to his throat, his breathing became labored, and a look of genuine shock replaced his earlier contentment. "You know," he whispered. "I know everything," Margaret confirmed, no longer bothering to hide her true nature. "About Mary, Sarah, and Elizabeth. About your journals, your correspondence, your plans. About what you intended to do to me tonight." Silas tried to stand, but the poison was already affecting his coordination. He collapsed back into his chair, his face pale, and his pupils dilated. "How?" he managed to ask. "I'm not like your other wives," Margaret said calmly. "I didn't come here looking for love or protection. I came here running from something worse than you. Which means I was already suspicious of everyone and everything. When you marry a con artist, you should expect to be conned." She reached into her dress pocket and withdrew his own journal, placing it on the table between them where he could see it clearly. "I found your shrine upstairs. Very touching, really. And your study was quite educational. Did you know you left detailed instructions for poison preparation? Very thorough work." Silas's eyes widened as he realized the full extent of her discovery. "The authorities, they'll never believe." "Oh, but they will," Margaret interrupted, "because I have evidence. Your journals, your correspondence, the hidden room, the poison recipes, and most importantly, I have you, dying from your own methods, while I sit here unharmed and able to tell the story of how I discovered my husband's murderous plans just in time to defend myself." She leaned forward, her voice taking on a harder edge. "You made one crucial mistake, Silas. You assumed that because I played the part of a devoted wife, I actually was one. You never considered that someone might be better at deception than you are." As the poison continued its work, Silas's breathing became increasingly labored. Margaret watched him with clinical detachment, occasionally checking the small pocket watch she'd brought to time the process. According to his own notes, death should occur within 30 minutes of ingestion. "The other wives," Silas gasped. "They loved me, truly loved me." "Maybe they did," Margaret acknowledged, "which makes what you did to them even more monstrous. They trusted you completely, and you betrayed that trust in the worst possible way." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the apple orchard where 3 graves marked the resting places of Silas's victims. "But I never loved you. I never trusted you. From the moment I arrived here, I was watching for the first sign that you weren't what you seemed. I just didn't expect it to take a full year to find the proof." Turning back to face her dying husband, Margaret continued, "I stayed because leaving would have meant giving up the security and respectability this marriage provided. I thought I could handle whatever unpleasantness might arise. I never imagined you were planning to murder me." Silas tried to speak again, but the words came out as an unintelligible whisper. Margaret checked her watch again, 25 minutes since he'd taken his first bite of poisoned pie. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. "I want you to understand something before you die," Margaret said, returning to her seat across from him. "I'm not just going to survive you. I'm going to make sure your story becomes a cautionary tale. Every woman who reads about what happened here will know to watch for the signs, to question men who seem too perfect, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong." She reached across the table and gently closed his journal, sliding it back toward her side of the table. "Your correspondence with other potential killers will be turned over to authorities. Your methods will be exposed so they can't be replicated. Your victims will be properly mourned instead of being forgotten as perfect memories in a madman's shrine." At exactly 30 minutes after his first bite of pie, Silas Blackwood drew his last breath. Margaret sat quietly for a moment, listening to the silence that filled the dining room. After a year of careful performance, of playing the role of the perfect wife while constantly watching for threats, it was finally over. But her work was far from finished. Margaret spent the rest of the night carefully staging the scene for the authorities who would inevitably arrive. She gathered all of Silas's journals and correspondence, organizing the evidence in a way that would tell a clear story. She photographed the hidden shrine room and documented the poison-making equipment. Most importantly, she prepared her own written account of the events, detailing her discovery of the murders and her desperate act of self-defense. When the sun rose on September 16, 1874, Margaret O'Sullivan was still alive, the first of Silas Blackwood's wives to survive her first anniversary. 3 days later, Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived at the Blackwood Ranch in response to a message Margaret had sent to town, reporting her husband's sudden death. What he found was a composed widow with an incredible story and extensive documentation to support every claim. "Mrs. Blackwood," the sheriff said, reviewing the evidence she'd presented, "this is quite possibly the most thoroughly documented case of serial murder I've ever encountered. Your husband kept remarkably detailed records." "He was a methodical man," Margaret replied calmly. "Even in his madness, he maintained his attention to detail." The investigation that followed confirmed everything Margaret had discovered. Examination of the 3 graves revealed that Mary, Sarah, and Elizabeth had indeed died from poison. The hidden room provided clear evidence of Silas's obsession with his deceased wives. The correspondence with other men revealed a network of potential killers that authorities were able to investigate and prevent. Margaret became something of a celebrity in the aftermath, known throughout the territory as the woman who'd outwitted a serial killer and exposed a conspiracy that could have claimed dozens of additional victims. Newspaper reporters traveled from as far as Denver and San Francisco to interview the Black Widow of Blackwood Ranch, as she came to be known. But Margaret had no interest in fame or notoriety. As soon as the legal proceedings were concluded and she'd inherited Silas's considerable estate, she began making plans for the next chapter of her life. The Blackwood Ranch was sold, with the proceeds used to establish a fund for widows and orphans in the Colorado Territory. The apple orchard where the 3 wives were buried became a proper cemetery, with elaborate headstones commemorating Mary, Sarah, and Elizabeth, not as perfect memories but as real women whose lives had been cut short by evil. Margaret herself disappeared from public view as mysteriously as she'd appeared 3 years earlier. Some said she'd returned to Chicago under an assumed name. Others claimed she'd traveled to California to start fresh. A few romantics insisted she'd found true love at last and was living quietly somewhere under yet another identity. The truth was simpler and more complex than any of the rumors. Margaret O'Sullivan had learned something important during her year as Mrs. Blackwood. She was stronger, smarter, and more capable than she'd ever imagined. The skills that had helped her survive Chicago's streets and Silas's murder plot could be used for more than just personal survival. Within a year of Silas's death, a mysterious woman began appearing in towns throughout the Colorado Territory and beyond, always in places where wives had died under suspicious circumstances or where women had reported feeling threatened by controlling husbands. This woman had an uncanny ability to uncover evidence of domestic violence and fraud, always managing to ensure that dangerous men faced justice while vulnerable women found the help they needed. She never stayed in one place long enough to be properly identified, and she never sought recognition or reward for her actions. Local authorities came to know her only as the Angel, a guardian spirit who appeared when women were in deadly danger and disappeared once they were safe. Margaret O'Sullivan had found her true calling at last. The skills she'd learned on Chicago's streets, refined during her year of marriage to a killer, now served a higher purpose. She'd become what she'd always needed during her own darkest moments, someone who fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Years later, sitting in a hotel room in a small Montana town where she'd just helped expose another wife killer, Margaret would sometimes take out the gold locket Silas had given her for their anniversary. She'd kept it not as a memento of their marriage, but as a reminder of what could happen when women failed to trust their instincts about the men in their lives. Inside the locket, instead of a photograph, she kept a small piece of paper with 4 names written in her careful handwriting: Mary Blackwood, Sarah Blackwood, Elizabeth Blackwood, and below them, crossed out but still visible, Margaret Blackwood. The crossed-out name served as a daily reminder that she'd chosen survival over victimhood, action over acceptance, and justice over silence. She was no longer Margaret Blackwood, the perfect wife of a perfect husband. She was something far more dangerous and infinitely more valuable, a woman who'd looked evil in the face and refused to blink. And somewhere in the territories, other women facing similar dangers would find themselves aided by mysterious circumstances, warned by anonymous letters, or rescued by inexplicable good fortune. They would never know that their salvation came from a former con artist turned widow turned avenging angel, a woman who'd learned that the best way to heal from surviving a monster was to make sure other monsters never got the chance to create more victims. The Blackwood Ranch stood empty for decades, eventually falling into ruin as the Colorado Territory became a state and the frontier gave way to civilization. But the story of what happened there lived on, passed down through generations of women who understood its true message: trust your instincts, question perfection, and never underestimate your own capacity for survival. Margaret O'Sullivan had answered Silas Blackwood's advertisements seeking a perfect wife. What he'd gotten instead was the perfect nemesis, someone who could match his cunning, exceed his ruthlessness, and ultimately ensure that his story served as a warning rather than an inspiration. In the end, Silas had been right about one thing. Their anniversary had indeed been very special, just not in the way he'd intended. If this story of survival, justice, and a woman's refusal to become a victim touched your heart, if you believe that even the most dangerous predators can be defeated by intelligence and determination, then you're in the right place. Here at Western Love Stories, we bring you tales that echo long after the last word fades. Stories of courage in the face of impossible odds, love that conquers evil, and hearts brave enough to fight for justice when no one else will. Subscribe to Western Love Stories and never miss a tale from the land where bullets may fly, but justice always finds its mark. Because out here, love isn't just a feeling, it's an act of courage that can change everything.